All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Alive. Now, before I get into the book, real quick, just wanted to kind of put the Epstein stuff into perspective. Now, if you remember when the JFK movie came out, the Oliver Stone version, it was like in the 90s. And so it was about 30 years after JFK was assassinated, right? And the Epstein stuff, for the most part, happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's about 20 years, although the first time he was arrested was in 2006, but it was for stuff that happened in like 2000 and before. So it's been about 20 years now or more, depending on when you want to start counting from what the actual Epstein stuff or the bulk of the stuff. Of course, people were still doing deals with him after that, but seems like he was being monitored a lot more. So if he was doing all this crazy stuff, I don't know. Maybe everyone's in on it and it's like a huge conspiracy and Trump's really like a satanic, what's it called? Satanic pedophile. Could be possible. Definitely possible. But just the fact that the stuff happened so long ago, it's kind of like, I don't know. I want to get excited about it, but all right, let's get into the book. Still on The New Era, 1957 to 1964, page 1168. It's like the third paragraph down. All right. The foreign policy of Red China has a number of diverse aims that hold quite distinct status on any list of Chinese priorities. Naturally, in first place is to avoid any foreign policy action that might jeopardize the communist regime in China. In second place is the desire to restore the traditional international position of old imperial China as a self-sufficient, isolated giant surrounded by subordinate tributary states. In this case, the tribute consists of ideological loyalty to the Chinese communist position. In third place is the Chinese desire to restore a unified ideological bloc on a worldwide basis supporting the true Chinese version of Marxist-Leninism. This version is not completely orthodox in traditional Marxist-Leninist terms, since it expects communist regimes to rise in backwards and ex-colonial countries rather than in advanced industrial countries, and expects these events to be precipitated and carried through by discontented peasants under intellectual leaders rather than by the industrial proletariat. On the other hand, this version is certainly closer to the facts of present-day politics on many points, such as the inevitability of revolution, the necessary imperialist aggression of advanced capitalist states, and the role of war as the midwife of communism is closer to Leninism than the ideas actually held in the Kremlin. The argument as to which version of communist ideology, the Chinese or Russian, is closer to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy is singularly unrewarding since both sides claim the advantage here, and the ideology itself, however interpreted, is so remote from the facts of economic social development in advanced countries that no real virtue can exist in being orthodox. The chief fact is that the Chinese version is potentially a much greater source of trouble to the outside world than Khrushchev's ideas of peaceful competition and non-inevitable war. The Chinese version is dangerous simply because it threatens the West in an area where it is particularly vulnerable and where it has shown no great competence, that is, among the underdeveloped nations. However, Chinese aggression in the period since 1954 has not been based on this third priority in its foreign policy schedule, but on its second priority, which seeks to create a belt of satellite subordinate states around the Chinese border. The year 1954 may be taken as the initial date in this effort because at that time the Peking government published a map of China that showed the Chinese border pushed deeply into Tibet, India, and Southeast Asia. As early as the end of 1949, the Red Chinese had commenced a moderate intervention in Vietnam, but their most successful effort to restore the traditional Chinese satellite system was in Tibet. China's suzerainty in Tibet has been generally recognized by the outside world, even in the years when China was rent by civil wars and banditry. The Treaty of May 23, 1957, Tibet itself accepted this status without recognizing that the status of suzerainty could become one of direct subordination under Chinese pressure. This pressure began at once and reached an acute stage in March 1959 when the Chinese authorities sought to arrest the Dalai Lama, head of the theocratic Tibetan government. The anti-Chinese revolt that resulted was crushed in 2 weeks, and the Dalai Lama fled to India. During this period, Chinese pressure continued into Southeastern Asia, in Burma, which desperately tried to maintain a neutralist course, and especially in the successor states from former Indochina. The subsequent division of Vietnam, the struggle for Laos, and the valiant efforts of Cambodia to follow Burma's path to neutralism have already been mentioned. For years, guerrilla operations in South Vietnam and Laos have permitted and increased Chinese intervention in the area and have made increasing demands on American wealth and power to oppose it. No solution to the problems of Southeast Asia can be based on the belief that its troubles arise wholly or even largely from communism or from Chinese aggression. For centuries, the central portion of the Malaysian peninsula, consisting of Laos and Cambodia along the Mekong River, has been under pressure from the Thai peoples to the west and the Vietnamese to the east. From at least the 17th century, the area we regard as Laos was divided into 3 or more petty kingdoms that were unable to unite in resistance to their more imperialist neighbors. The French hegemony in all of Indochina from the 19th century to the Japanese invasion in 1942 suspended this process, but it would have been resumed in any case with the collapse of the French colonial system there in 1954. So too, the southward movement of the Chinese, attracted by the rich rice lands of the Malaysian river deltas, would have occurred in any case, even if communism had never been invented. The communist issue simply added another very acute issue to a complex situation. As we have seen, French expenditure of $7 billion and about 100,000 lives during an 8-year struggle ended at Geneva in 1954. The Geneva Agreement opened the way to a succession of troubles in Laos by recognizing the leftist Pathet Lao as the government of 2 provinces and recommending that it be admitted to a coalition government after approved ceasefire and free elections. The most vital clause that provided that all foreign military forces except a French training group be withdrawn from Laos, An international control commission representing India, Poland, and Canada was to supervise these provisions. These agreements settled nothing. The elections of December 1955 brought the premiership to Prince Salvana Foma. He was a neutralist and brother of Sauphan Novon, a communist fellow traveler and founder of Pathet Lao. The two brothers brought Pathet Lao into the government, but it did not give up its military bases in the two provinces it dominated. The withdrawal of other military forces greatly increased the potential power of Pathet Lao. When the latter showed increased strength in subsequent elections in May 1958, the anti-communist group combined in August to oust Salvana Fuma and put in as premier the pro-Western Phao Sananikone. This government in turn was ejected and replaced by a right-wing military junta led by General Fomi Nosavan in January 1960, but within 7 months a new coup, this time from the left and led by Kong Lee, changed the regime and brought Savannah Phauma back to office. 4 months later, in December 1960, Nosavan once again replaced Phauma by military force. The communist countries refused to recognize this change, continued to recognize Salvana Foma, and increased their supplies to the guerrilla Pathet Lao by Soviet airlift. In March 1961, England and France, acting through SEATO Conference in Bangkok, vetoed any direct American or SEATO intervention in Laos. At the suggestion of Soviet Russia, the Geneva Conference was reassembled in 1962 and drew up two complicated agreements whose chief consequence was to revive the agreements of 1954 within a more neutralized frame: coalition government, elimination of all foreign military forces, neutrality, and a reactivation of the International Control Commission. The resulting Troika coalition of leftists, neutrals, and rightists served to paralyze the country, while the Pathet Lao guerrillas, using communist North Vietnam as a base, threatened to secure control of the whole country. This effort broke out into open warfare in the Plain des Harris in April 1963. The growing success of these attacks over the next few years greatly agitated Washington, where officials generally felt that the fall of Laos, because of its central position, might well lead to a succession of communist takeovers in Cambodia, South Vietnam, Thailand, and Burma, leaving India wide open to a Red Chinese intrusion directly across these collaborating areas into the Indian plains. Some substance was lent to this fear from the fact that Red China spent the years 1955 to 1958 constructing a number of military roads that linked Sinkiang, I don't know how to pronounce that, I think it's Sinkiang, to Tibet, with offshoots southward towards the Malay Peninsula. This fear became intensified in 1962 to 1964 as a consequence of the communist takeover in Burma, the American fiascos in Vietnam, and the direct Chinese attack on India. The strange thing about Burma was that the increase in communist power was brought about by the army, which was increasingly dissatisfied by the ineffectual and corrupt government of the democratic U Nu. The latter, who was personally sincere, idealistic, and honest, represented the Burmese desire for peace, democracy, and unity from World War II on. By October 1958, however, his subordinates in the government had paralyzed the government with bickering and corruption. When the ruling anti-fascist party split, U Nu judged it impossible to carry out the approaching elections and yielded control of the country to a caretaker military government that promised to restore unity, honesty, and adequate administration and supervise the elections. By February 1960, the military leaders judged their task to be achieved and held the new election. UNU UNU's section of the anti-fascist party won a sweeping victory, and he returned to office. The restored premier made valiant efforts to establish national unity, to raise the level of public spirit and cooperation, and to placate the various groups that divided the country, but was no more successful in restraining partisan conflict and corruption in 1960 to 1962 than he had been in the period before October 1958. Accordingly, in March 1962, another military coup led by General Ne Win ousted Yu Nu, suspended the Constitution, and ruled through a junta of 17 officers. Soon an effort was made to merge all political groups into a single national political party with a socialist program. The communists were treated with increasing leniency, while leaders of democratic groups continued to languish in prison. Students and other dissident groups were violently suppressed, and civil liberties were generally curtailed. Suddenly, in February 1963, a completely socialist regime was established by the nationalization of most property rights under increasing communist influence. Although Burma has sought to hold a neutralist course in foreign affairs, it has been drifting towards the Red Chinese camp. Late in 1960, a protracted frontier dispute between the two nations was ended by an agreement that was generally favorable to Burma, and a few months later, in 1961, the two countries signed an economic agreement that brought Burma a loan of $84 million and technical cooperation from China. Like everything in Burma, this was implemented in a lackadaisical fashion, and the Burmese economic situation has deteriorated steadily since World War II. Part of this has been due to increased difficulty in marketing Burma's chief exports, rice and lumber, but the chief problem has been the steady increase in population, which has reduced the per capita income by about a third, although national income as a whole has increased about a seventh since independence was won in 1948. While Burma, on the western edge of the Malay Peninsula, thus drifted towards communism, Vietnam, on the eastern edge, moved in the same direction with violent struggles. The Geneva Agreement of 1954 had recognized the communist government of North Vietnam, dividing the country at the 17th parallel, but this imaginary line across jungle terrain could not keep discontent or communist guerrillas out of South Vietnam so long as the American-supported Southern government carried on its tasks with corruption, favoritism, and arbitrary despotism. These growing characteristics of the Vietnam government centered around the antics of the Diem family. The nominal leader of the family was President Ngo Diem, although the fanatical spirit of it was his brother's wife, Madame Nhu. The brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, was the actual power in the government, residing in the palace and heading up a semi-secret political organization that controlled all military and civilian appointments. Madame Nhu's father, Tran Van Chung, who resigned from his post as Vietnam ambassador to the United States as a protest against the arbitrary nature of the Diem family government, summed up his daughter's career as a very sad case of power madness. The same authority spoke of President Diem as a devoted Roman Catholic with the mind of a medieval inquisitor. On the Diem family team were three other brothers, including the Catholic Archbishop of Vietnam, the country's ambassador in London, and the political boss of Central Vietnam, who had his own police force. The Diem family tyranny came to grief from its inability to keep in touch with reality and to establish some sensible conception of what was important. While the country was in its relentless struggle with the Viet Cong communist guerrillas who lurked in jungle areas, striking without warning at peasant villages that submitted to the established government or did not cooperate with the rebels, the Diem family was engaged in such pointless tasks as crushing Saigon high school agitation by secret police raids or efforts to persecute the overwhelming Buddhist majority and to extend favors to the Roman Catholics, who were less than 10% of the population. When Diem became president in 1955, after the deposition of the pro-French Bao Dai, the country had just received 800,000 refugees from North Vietnam, which the Geneva Conference of 1954 had yielded to Ho Chi Minh's communists. The overwhelming majority of these refugees were Roman Catholics, and their arrival raised the Catholic population of South Vietnam to over 1 million in total population of about 14 million. Nevertheless, President Diem made these Catholics the chief basis of his power, chiefly by recruiting the refugees into various police forces dominated by the Diem family. By 1955, these were already beginning to persecute the Buddhist majority, at first by harassing their religious festivals and parades, but later with brutal assaults on their meetings. An attempted coup d'etat by army units which attacked the royal palace in November 1960 was crushed. From that date on, the Diem rule became increasingly arbitrary. In the middle of all this disturbance, American aid tried to revive the country's economy, and American military assistance tried to curtail the depredations of the communist guerrillas. The two together amounted to about $200 million a year, although economic aid alone was originally twice this figure. The intensity of the guerrilla attacks steadily increased following President Diem's re-election with 88% of the vote in April 1961. As these attacks slowly increased, the American intervention was also stepped up and gradually began to shift from a purely advisory and training role to increasingly direct participation in the conflict. From 1961 onward, American casualties averaged about 1 dead a week, year after year. So 52 people a year. The communist guerrilla casualties were reported to be about 500 per week, but this did not seem to diminish their total numbers or relax their attacks, even in periods when their casualties were heavy. These guerrilla attacks consisted of rather purposeless destruction of peasant homes and villages, apparently designed to convince the natives of the importance of the government and the ability of cooperating with the rebels. To stop these depredations, the government undertook the giant task of organizing the peasants into agrovilles or strategic hamlets, which were to be strongly defended residential centers entirely enclosed behind barricades. The process, it was said, would also improve the economic and social welfare of the people to give them a greater incentive to resist the rebels. There was considerable doubt about their effectiveness of the reform aspect of this process, and some doubt about the defensive possibilities of the scheme as a whole. The American advisors patrolled stalking patrols to seek out the guerrillas rather than static defenses, stressed the need for night rather than only daytime counteractions, and the use of the rifle instead of large-scale reliance on air power and artillery. Moreover, most observers felt that very little of America's economic aid ever reached the village level, but instead was lost on much higher levels, beginning with the royal palace itself. By the summer of 1963, guerrillas were staging successful attacks on the strategic hamlets, and the need for a more active policy became acute. Unfortunately, just at that time, the domestic crisis in Vietnam was also becoming acute. This final crisis in the story of the Diem family and its henchmen arose from religious persecution of the Buddhists under the guise of maintaining political order. Restrictions on Buddhist ceremonies led to Buddhist protests, and these in turn led to violent police action. The Buddhists struck back in a typically Asiatic fashion, which, because it was Asiatic, proved to be very effective in the Asiatic context. Individuals or small groups of Buddhists committed suicide in some crowded public place near a governmental center. The favorite mode of suicide was to drench the victim's long yellow robes with gasoline and ignite these with a match as he knelt in the public square or street. The calloused reaction of the Diem family, especially Madame Nu, shocked the world, and outraged feelings rose rapidly in the summer of 1963. When 35 university professors and a number of public officials, including the father of Madame Nu, resigned, the police attacked Buddhist shrines, arresting hundreds of their priests. Student agitations led to the closing of Saigon University and of all public and private schools, with the arrest of many students. The United Nations Fact-Finding Commission was isolated by Diem police. On October 1st, 1963, an American-encouraged military coup led by General Dong Van Min overthrew the Diem family, killing several of its members. A new government, with a Buddhist premier, calmed down the domestic crisis, but by 1964 showed itself no more able to suppress guerrilla activities than its predecessors had been. The Red Chinese intervention in Southeast Asia, except perhaps in Burma, was generally indirect and through intermediaries. Elsewhere in Southern and Eastern Asia, this was not true. But in all areas from 1960 onward, it was evident that the increase in Chinese influence was not so much at the expense of the United States as it was at the expense of the Soviet Union. In North Vietnam and Burma, the Chinese influence was direct before 1960, but after that date it grew stronger in Laos, South Vietnam, and Siam, while Cambodia vainly sought to obtain a guarantee of its neutrality from all concerned. In North Korea, the change was dramatic, since the dormant Soviet influence there was replaced by open Chinese influence in 1961. A similar process could be observed in Southern Asia, especially Pakistan and even India. The Chinese invasion and crushing of Tibet in March 1959 revealed that they had constructed a military road from Sinkiang to Lhasa. The Dalai Lama, in exile in India, accused the Chinese of genocide, and it seemed clear that a third of a million Chinese had moved into southern Tibet after resistance was crushed. Many Tibetans were compelled to work on a 1,500-mile railroad from China to Lhasa and on a road system towards the borders of India, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan. Thousands of Tibetan refugees crowded into these countries, while others were machine-gunned by the Chinese as they fled. Many Buddhist shrines and lamaseries were destroyed. By October 1962, Chinese-Indian border incidents on territory claimed by both erupted into open war. The consequences were startling. Indian forces collapsed almost at once and were revealed to be almost wholly lacking in supplies, training, and fighting spirit. As the responsible officials concerned the Minister of Defense and Vice Premier Krishna Menon, a close advisor of Nehru, an open sympathizer with the Soviet Union, and a skilled and sardonic baiter of the West, was removed from power. India's appeal for aid was answered by the United States with $5 million worth of weapons by November 10th, but the Soviet Union found itself in the cruel dilemma of either abandoning its long efforts to win over India or contributing to a war on its nominal ally, China. It abandoned the former by suspending arms shipments already committed. Most ominous of all, by the end of November 1962, the Indian military collapse was so complete that it became clear that China could achieve in 3 months what Japan had sought to achieve without success throughout World War II, a breakthrough with ground forces into the Indian plain. Such a breakthrough was, apparently, not China's aim. Its chief concerns seemed to have been to secure control of Aksai Chin of the Aksai Chin area where the territories of China, India, and the Soviet Union converge. Chinese domination of this inaccessible area and improvements of Chinese communications there is a threat to the Soviet Union rather than to India, which has generally ignored the area. The Chinese desire to hold the region may be part of a scheme to relieve Soviet pressure on the Chinese borders farther east near Mongolia. In any case, the Chinese resort to war on India must have been a consequence of very complex motivations and surely gave rise to complicated consequences. It was aimed at the Soviet Union and the United States rather than at India, but it did serve to discredit all concerned, to demonstrate the power and vigor of the new China, and to cut down drastically the Indian way, as contrasted with the Chinese way, as a model for other underdeveloped Asiatic nations. One notable consequence of the Chinese attack on India was that it served to pull Pakistan further out of the Western camp towards the communist side of neutralism. Pakistan, as a member of both Centro and SEATO, had a vital position in John Foster Dulles' line of paper barriers surrounding the Soviet heartland, but in Pakistani eyes, the controversy with India over Kashmir was one of more immediate and more intense appeal. The Chinese humiliation of India was received with ill-concealed pleasure in Pakistan, although the Chinese were also intruding on some areas claimed by Pakistan. These disputes were settled by a frontier treaty with China in May 1962, and the Muslim state showed increased confidence that its claims against India over Kashmir would obtain Chinese support. During all these events, the division between the Soviet Union and Red China became increasingly public and increasingly bitter. As usual, the communist controversies, they were enveloped in complicated ideological disputes. By 1962, the Chinese had reached the point where they were accusing Khrushchev of betraying the revolution and the whole communist movement from a combination of increasingly bourgeois obsessions with Russian standards of living and a cowardly fear of American missile power. Thus, they accused the Soviet Union of betraying international communism in accepting polycentrism, especially in Yugoslavia, and the weakness in accepting peaceful coexistence, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev alternated between striking back at the Chinese criticism and seeking to stifle them in order to avoid a complete ideological split of the world communist movement. The Chinese were adamant and continued to work toward such a split, seeking to win over their side of the communist movement and communist parties throughout the world, especially in the more backward countries where the Chinese experience often seemed more relevant. By 1964, the split within the communist movement seemed unbridgeable. All right, the next section is the eclipse of colonialism. One of the most profound and most rapid changes of the post-war period has been the disintegration of the pre-war colonial empires, beginning with the Dutch in the Netherlands, Indies, and ending with the Portuguese in Africa and elsewhere. We have no need to go into any detailed narration of the events that accompanied this process in specific areas, but the movement as a whole is of such great importance that it must be analyzed. When World War II began in 1939, a quarter of the human race, 600 million people, mostly with non-white skins, were colonial subjects of European states. Almost all of these, with the exception of those under Portuguese rule, won independence in the 20 years following the Japanese surrender in 1945. Except in a few areas, such as the Dutch Indies, French Indochina, and British Malaya, which had been under Japanese occupation during the war, the anti-colonial movement was not significant until a decade or more after the war's end. In many places, especially in Africa, the movement towards independence was of little importance until 1956. Nevertheless, the war may be regarded as the trigger for the whole process, since the early defeats suffered by the Netherlands, France, and Britain, especially when they were inflicted by an Asiatic people, the Japanese gave a deadly blow to the prestige of European rulers. The war also mobilized many natives into military activities, during which they learned to use arms and were often moved to unfamiliar areas where they discovered that the subordination of natives to Europeans, and especially the subjection of dark-skinned peoples to whites, was not an immutable law of nature. These events also showed many native peoples that their tribal divisions were but local and parochial concerns, and that they could and must learn to cooperate with other persons of different tribes, different languages, and even different religions to face common problems that could be overcome only by cooperative efforts. In many cases, the great demands and high prices for native products during the war gave native peoples, for the first time, a realization that the contrast of European affluence and native poverty was not an eternal and unchangeable dichotomy. Accordingly, such peoples were unwilling to accept the decreasing demand, falling prices, and declining standards of living of the post-war period, and determined to take political action to obtain independent control of their own economic situation. Moreover, just at that time, the communist argument that colonial impoverishment and European affluence arose from the exploitation of colonial peoples by imperialist powers began to spread in Asia and Africa, brought back from imperial cities like London and Paris, where small groups of natives in search of education had come in contact with communist propagandists. Except for this last point, these factors were closely associated with the war and its outcome. But there were other influences of a much longer duration. The acquisition of European languages that permitted native peoples to surmount the linguistic isolation of their tribal differences had begun in the 19th century, but by 1950 had become a more widespread phenomenon, especially among those natives who were most unwilling to fall back into tribal apathy and inferior status. Many natives, in one way or another, had acquired a smattering or more of European education, and with this, even when it entailed a respect and affection for European culture, They had picked up much of the basic libertarian outlook endemic in European politics. In fact, in British colonial areas, educated natives had been systematically inculcated with English theories of political resistance and self rule, which went back to the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution. Thus, the myths of English history became part of the solvent of the British imperial structure. Another factor, which had been going on for a considerable time in 1956, was the process of detribalization associated with the growth of cities and the development of commercial and craft activities that brought many diverse subjects of colonialism together in urban districts or trade unions outside the stabilizing nexus of their previous tribal associations or of their peasant communities. Better educated and more energetic individuals among these natives took advantage of this situation to organize groups and parties to agitate for a larger share in the political control of their own affairs and eventual independence. In spite of the pressure and even the power of these changes in the colonial situation on the side of the subject peoples, there were at least equally significant and largely unorganized changes on the side of their imperial rulers. For it must be recognized that in very few cases did the native peoples achieve independence as a consequence of a successful revolt by force. On the contrary, in case after case, independence was granted after a relatively moderate agitation by a former ruling power which showed a certain relief to be rid of its colonial burden. This indicates a profound change in attitudes towards colonies within the imperialist countries. The significance of this change can hardly be denied. The real question is concerned with its causes. Before 1940, the possession of colonial territories was of little direct concern to most persons in the imperial homeland. They knew that their country had colonies and ruled over peoples quite different from themselves, and this was regarded, rather generally, as probably a good thing, a source of pride to most citizens, and probably of some material advantage to the country as a whole. The costs of holding colonial areas were not generally recognized and were usually felt to be minor and incidental, but in the post-war period, these costs very rapidly became major and direct charges, quite unacceptable to the ordinary citizens when the post-war period and increased anti-colonial agitations required heavy taxation and compulsory military service to regain or to retain such colonial areas. Once this was recognized, the former rather vague satisfaction with colonial possession soon disappeared, and there was a rapidly spreading conviction that colonies were not worth it. The burden of taxes and military service in remote areas was regarded as part of the war to be ended as completely as possible, with the war itself not to be continued indefinitely into the post-war period. Another closely related change occurred in economic aspirations. The citizens of the European colonial powers had survived 6 years of hardships in the war itself, and in most cases, a decade or more of economic hardships in the pre-war depression. The war demonstrated that such economic hardships had been needless. The massive economic mobilization for the war showed clearly that there could be an equally massive post-war mobilization of resources for prosperity. The ordinary European was determined to obtain the rising standards of living and welfare security that he had been denied in the Depression and war, and he had no stomach to be denied these any longer in order to hold in subjection native peoples who wanted independence. Thus, the former beneficiaries and upholders of empire, usually restricted to an upper-class minority or Specialized interest groups found that these interests no longer would be supported by the majority of their own citizens. In some cases, independence was achieved after a period of violence, rioting, and guerrilla warfare, although in no case did these actions, however extensive, become a matching of force between the colonial area and the imperial power. In no case could these powers be matched, since the latter was overwhelmingly larger. In most cases, a more or less token display of force by the colonial peoples showed that they could be subdued only by an expenditure of resources and inconveniences which the ruling power decided it did not care to make. The existence of the Soviet bloc and the appearance of the Cold War, with its almost irresistible demands for expenditure of resources, helped to tip the decision towards independence. Moreover, the opinion of the United States was favorable to independence for subject peoples in a rather doctrinaire and naive anti-colonialism rooted in the American revolutionary tradition, without regard for the very great benefits the peoples had obtained from their European rulers. Resistance to the decolonizing process was strong only in exceptional cases, such as in the French army and in the Portuguese ruling groups. In Portugal, the despotic character of the regime made it possible for the adherents of the colonial system to sustain the policy of resistance to independence, but the role of the French army, especially in Indochina and Algeria, was almost unique. This unique quality in the Algerian crisis rested on three factors. One, Algeria, which had been held by France since 1830, was constitutionally part of France, and its problem was of the domestic history of the metropolitan country, since 30 of its 626 members of the French Assembly represented Algeria. Two, in Algeria, there was a large group of European settlers, about 12% of the total population, who could not be turned over to an independent Arab majority, whom they had treated as inferior for years. And three, the French army, after a series of defeats from 1940 to Indochina in 1954, resolved not to be defeated in Algeria and was prepared to overthrow by civil war any French cabinet that wished to grant independence to that area. Bitterness in Algeria was intensified by many other issues, including drastic religious, economic, social, and intellectual contrast between the European settlers and the Algerian majority. The latter, for example, as a result of French medical skills, had one of the world's major population explosions, while the settlers owned most of the land and almost all the local economic activities. The bitterness of the Algerian struggle the bitterness of the Algerian struggle almost exceeded belief, as the extremists on each side adopted intransigent positions and sought to eliminate by assassination the more moderate of their own groups. Both sides resorted to strikes and riots in the cities, guerrilla operations, and farm burning in rural areas, and assassination in France itself. By 1960, indiscriminate bombings and reprisals against innocent peoples were alienating increasing numbers of persons from the extremes towards more moderate positions near the center, although the extremists, as they decreased in numbers, became more violent in action. In 1958, the crisis brought General de Gaulle back to office in France from retirement, largely because his supreme self-confidence and ambiguous position on the chief issues of controversy gave grounds for belief that he could find some solution to the crisis, or at least could maintain domestic order. This change ended the Fourth French Republic and brought into existence a new regime, the Fifth Republic, whose constitutional provisions were custom-made to de Gaulle's type of despotic ambiguity, 1958. It took almost 4 years before agreement was reached between the Algerian rebels and the de Gaulle regime on a settlement of the Algerian dispute, March 18, 1962. Even then, sporadic violence continued for months. The final cost of the Algerian crisis over 7 years has been estimated at 250,000 lives and $20 billion. The intensity of this conflict and the socialistic policies of the new Algerian government of Mohammed bin Bella provided an unattractive feature to the previously superior European settlers, and many of these left the country to seek residence elsewhere, chiefly in France, although only a small portion of them were of French origin. The erratic instability and demagoguery associated with so many newly independent states was displayed by Ben Bella during his visit to the Western Hemisphere in October 1962. Although he came to seek economic concessions and was given an especially warm welcome by President Kennedy, a few days later he visited Castro in Cuba and made a scathing attack on United States policy, demanding American evacuation of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. That didn't happen. The following month, on his return home, Ben Bella nationalized mines, power, foreign trade, and much of the lands of European settlers. At the same time, the Communist Party was outlawed and hundreds of enemies of the regime were arrested. A number of newly independent states followed what we might call the Nasser pattern of post-colonial policy. This involved a large amount of verbal attack on the United States and the European ex-colonial powers, a rather ambivalent but generally favorable attitude towards the Soviet bloc, and a less public effort to obtain Western aid or economic concessions to compensate for the basic inability of the Soviet bloc to provide such aid. With this double policy, there frequently went a rather aggressive attitude towards neighbors with which the new state had real or fancied grievances, which were played up at critical moments as a cover for the inability of the new regimes to cope with the post liberation economic and social problems of their own peoples. In many cases, such as Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasir, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Castro, these leaders sought to exercise the qualities of personal popularity and superhuman personification of popular aspirations that we call charismatic leadership. None of these policies or attitudes was much help in coping with the very real problems that have faced the newly independent nations with growing urgency. The enthusiasm that greeted independence and the acceptance by the world of that status through admission to the United Nations was followed, in most cases, by a post-independence reaction as the scope and almost insoluble nature of each country's problems had to be recognized. The nature of these problems must be evident from what has already been said. At a minimum, they could be divided into 3 or 4 groupings concerned with the patterns of power, wealth, of social relationships, and of outlook. In the European tradition, power has tended to rest on some kind of synthesis of military force, economic material rewards, and ideological elements, and on some kind of political structure, such as the parliamentary system, in which the opposition was incorporated into the constitutional system. In most colonial or backwards areas, power has tended to rest on other aspects of the total social structure, notably on religion or on social pressures derived from kinship and tribal groupings, or from stable social patterns in villages or residential patterns. There has been a tendency towards conformity and even uniformity. Opposition groups and diversity have tended to be encapsulated into exogenous social groupings like the castes of India. In these traditional societies, except where the English tradition was successfully established, there has been a reluctance to accept majority rule or the organized oppositional structure of the parliamentary system because of the native desire for a unified social context. Instead of decision by majority rule, which was often unacceptable to native peoples because it seemed to force an alienated situation on the minority, native peoples in many areas preferred to reach decisions by what could be called reaching a consensus. This method, exemplified in American Indian powwow or American business conferences, achieved agreement and decision usually unanimously by comment from each person present in a sequence until consensus was reached. The difficulty of using this method in the large assemblies of newly independent governments often led to other mechanisms for achieving unanimity, such as a constitutional provision that any political party that captured a majority of the vote should have all the seats. To the Western European, such rule seemed to be a scandalous refusal to listen to minority opinion. To natives, it often seems a most necessary mechanism for preserving solidarity. Really, it is a mechanism for keeping diverse opinions behind the scene, out of public view, and force the reconciliation of differences to take place in some concealed area backstage intrigue and discussion rather than out in the public arena of the National Assembly. The latter body becomes a mechanism for publicly demonstrating national solidarity or for proclaiming public policy rather than an area of conflict as it had become in the Western European parliamentary system. This tendency to seek a public display of uniformity and national solidarity through political and constitutional processes was evident in Hitler's Third Reich as it had been in other recent European authoritarian states, including the Soviet Union, and has also appeared in the more traditionally free governments of Western Europe and the United States. The European tradition to seek a settlement of disputes or differences by force in a battle was evident in the feudal tradition, in the electoral and parliamentary systems, in the contentious and rather investigatory nature of English legal procedure, and in the European and especially English obsession with sports and athletic contests. It is part of the warlike tradition of Europe that gave it the weapons development and political power to dominate the world. Such an emphasis on force as a prime factor in human life is rarer in colonial areas, especially in those where peasant traditions are strong and pastoral traditions are weak, such as India, Southeast Asia, China, and much of Negro Africa. In these areas, force often appeared in a ritual or symbolic way, so that the outcome of the battle was settled by the infliction of a single casualty, which was taken to indicate a religious or magical settlement of the dispute, making further conflict unnecessary. This reluctance to use the use of force in social life in many colonial areas has raised the problems of how the areas claimed by these new nations can be defended either against their more aggressive neighbors or against more militant tribes or groups within their own population. In many areas, notably in Africa, the existing boundaries of the new nations have no relationship to any power structure or to any existing factual realities at all. As colonies, these areas' boundaries reflected to some extent the power relationships of their imperial countries in Europe, but now that independence has been achieved, the boundaries reflect nothing. In many cases, the existing boundary, drawn as a straight line on the map, cuts through the center of tribal areas, the only existing local political reality. The lack of a military tradition in many ex-colonial areas makes defense a difficult problem, as was shown in the Indian defensive weakness during the Red Chinese attack in 1962. In many areas, natives are eager to become soldiers because of the salaries and benefits associated with the role, but they do not regard fighting as part of the role. In many cases, they become pressure groups seeking additional benefits and may become a considerable burden on the new nation's budget and a threat to the stability of the state itself, while providing little or no protection to the state against possible outside enemies. All right. I'm just going to stop reading there. There's like 10 pages left in this chapter. Just about. All right. So what do we got there? Basically, it was finishing off the Southeast Asia part, where it was like, seems like a lot of these countries wanted to remain neutral, but it was either between communism and capitalism. And after we lost the Vietnam War and didn't really do too well in the Korean War, all the other countries in there, Cambodia, Thailand, and all that stuff, they were like, well, maybe working with America is not the best idea. Maybe we should lean towards communist China because they're closer and they seem pretty powerful. They did more than Japan in the war. And then, of course, going into colonialism in India and Africa and places like that. Obviously, it seems like India did a little better with the colonialism than Africa. But like I was saying before, it's because you can see that in Europe, they ran out of money after World War II, so they couldn't really maintain the colonialism. And then in the United States, colonialism became very unpopular because we were projecting, American revolutionary values onto tribal African peoples that probably needed a little bit more time getting educated and developing their industries and stuff. But instead, it was outright rejected, basically as like racist and like almost similar to slavery, which it could be argued. I mean, definitely they could have done a little bit better with the economic trade and giving Africans like more benefits for the resources that they take. But at the same time, they were giving education, building roads. The train system was horrible though, because they basically just built a train system that went to where the resources are and then back to the coast. They never built like an intercontinental railway system that like connected all the different countries in Africa together. So that was part of the problem too, because it was like all the rail lines are just one straight line going into the center of Africa and then back to the coast. There's no like circular, or circular or transnational railway line that was built by the colonialists. They just built it to take the stuff out of the country. So that was like a big setback too, that there's not like a, interstate or international road system or railway system in Africa. So that kind of set them back too for a while. And of course, obviously it's like has the most languages. So then everyone either had to speak French or English because they couldn't keep their tribal languages. And when you lose that, you lose a lot of your traditions and your cultural stories and your cultural values, because language does affect how you think. And then they took on a lot of English and European cultural values and stories and stuff like that. Because, I mean, obviously, if you're going to teach your kids Humpty Dumpty, it's English, right? It's the English thing. So when you speak English, then you teach English stories and fables and all that other stuff. Not saying there's anything wrong with it, but obviously they're going to lose their cultural values in a sense. And not for nothing, a lot of these places, they didn't even have a written language really in Africa. A lot of the countries didn't have a written language. They didn't really have like what we would consider now like nations, or they were just tribal peoples that had like a mother tongue, and that was basically their language group, was their tribe. and the little region where they lived in between this river and this tree and this rock. That was our area for hunting or whatever thing they did. So you can say a lot about colonialism, but it seems like it was maybe it was either like you should have never did it at all, or they probably should have stayed a little bit longer and helped develop more. But after the war, Europe ran out of money and Americans just found it unethical. So they kind of ended it, and not in a good way. It really wasn't a good way, because what happened was then basically like kind of like the Uncle Toms that were working with the white people, which in a sense were kind of like worse than the white people because they were trying to like copy the colonialist like methods, but they weren't really as European. So when they took over after like the Europeans left, they actually abused the like normal African people more than the Europeans did, because they didn't really understand the intricacies of what the Europeans were doing, and they just saw them taking resources and being kind of like I guess authoritarian to people, and they were like, well, we'll just do that. We'll just take all the resources for ourselves and be like super authoritarian to everyone. But they couldn't bring like European education, road building, plumbing, electricity, all that type of stuff. So it kind of actually messed the countries up more. So, all right. That's the video for today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.